Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast.
Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. I am going to go ahead and apologize if my voice sounds weird. It's because I'm sick. It's that great time of year when seasonal colds are everywhere. So today's episode is actually brought to you by NyQuil. Just kidding. But seriously, I don't know. It's been rough the last few days, like trying to get sleep, trying to get rid of the fever and the aching and chills. So yeah, this episode may be just a little bit scattered. Hopefully it doesn't sound like a cough syrup induced fever dream. But speaking of fever dreams, today for episode 8, we're going to be talking about The Secret of Redgate Farm. And you want to talk about a fever dream. This is such a strange book. I think it's up there with Lilac Inn as far as so many weird things happen in this book. I mean, there's no shark-shaped submarines, but there's cults, there's weird perfume, there's all kinds of things. Money laundering, all the best things that you need in a mystery. So to start off, this is book number 6 in the Nancy Drew series, and it was published in 1931. And I always have thought that this was kind of a cool book because there's actually a Redgate farm near where I live. And as a kid, I was reading the book about the same time that I figured that out. And I was like, oh, maybe there's a cult where people wear bed sheets and run around and dance in the moonlight, which that in itself is weird. And we'll get to that also. So, of course, I like to come up with spoof covers of the Nancy Drew books. Like if I were to look at the book and I didn't know what it was about, I would come up with this fake title. So I came up with 2 for this book. And this is, of course, going off the revised version of the cover. But the first spoof that I came up with is Nancy Drew in the Cave of Wonders. Because Nancy's literally just hiding behind this tree and kind of peeping over at this cave. And you can see one of the cult members going into the cave. And the second spoof that I came up with is The Secret of How to Join a Cult. Because this book, it centers around this fake cult, spoiler alert, the Black Snake Colony, and it always makes me laugh to see these covers because some of them are so crazy looking, and there's also some negative kind of connotations with what these people look like because, I mean, they're wearing white hooded robes, and there's a few groups that are associated with wearing such clothing. I'll let you figure that one out. It's a group associated with 3 letters and it ain't the CIA. So yeah, that's a bit unfortunate, but we're going to jump right into these covers and kind of discuss what they look like. So for our first cover for The Secret of Redgate Farm, that is of course by Russell Tandy, and it shows Nancy in a dress and a cardigan with short blonde hair, and she's looking over at this field where there are several people wearing these white ceremonial robes, and they're dancing under a full moon. Now, the second cover for this book that I found, I believe, is a rare version from the UK, and it kind of shows a similar scene. We have what I believe is Nancy. Her hair is super blonde, and I think that's George that's with her, and they're looking over these bushes at, again, these people wearing these white robes, and they've got their hands up in the air. It honestly looks a little more sinister than the first version, but I don't know. They're both kind of weird. As for the third and final cover of The Secret of Redgate Farm, we have Nancy kind of off to the left of the cover, and she's looking around this tree, and we see what we believe is one of these cult members in the white robe going into a cave. And this is the cover that I grew up with. Nancy has the super blonde curled hair, and she's wearing like what looks like a maroon or red skirt and a pink sweater. Interesting color choice. So honestly, as far as giving these covers a magnifying glass rating, I'm not going to lie, I don't really like any of these covers. I would say that I definitely favor Russell Tandy because I like his dreamy kind of 1930s aesthetic and how he creates the covers, but I really didn't like any of these, so I said 2 magnifying glasses. And I don't know, it's just not my favorite cover. Also, if you're new to the podcast or new to Nancy Drew and you want to see these covers that I'm talking about, every week before Thursday, I like to post these covers and get your all's vote on which one's your favorite. And then this way you can also see kind of what I'm describing on the podcast. But our Instagram handle is True Drew Podcast. Now, on to the characters that are in this book. So, alongside Nancy, we have Bess and George, who are helping us to solve this mystery. And they encounter a woman named Joanne Bird on the train from River Heights. And then Joanne Bird has her grandmother, I believe, Mrs. Bird. There is also a character named Yvonne Wong, who is a perfume sales lady, and Reuben Ames, who is the caretaker at the Birds farm. So I tried my best to come up with a brief synopsis, and here it is. Nancy, Bess, and George are on a train after a shopping trip, and Bess spills an expensive perfume that she bought, which Nancy thinks the merchant didn't want to sell her. The fumes fill the train car, and a girl passes out. Nancy goes to get her water, and a man mysteriously asks her if she's heard anything from the chief. When Nancy looks confused, he apologizes and leaves. The girl who fainted, Joanne Bird, is looking for a job in River Heights, so Nancy invites her home for a snack and a ride. Joanne needs a job or her grandmother will lose their property, Redgate Farm. She goes to an interview, but the man tries to hire Nancy instead. He also writes down what looks like a code, which Nancy copies down to decipher. Nancy and the girls decide to go to Joanne's farm and board there to help with finances. They're told a man named Mr. Kent keeps harassing the Birds to buy the farm, and there's a mysterious cult renting a section of their land called the Black Snake Colony. Nancy suspects that the Blue Jade perfume, Hale Syndicate, and this cult may be linked. The girls all witness the members of the cult doing a weird dance ritual at night and decide they need to find out what's going on. The girls help with chores in the meantime, and Nancy finds a woman from the cult hurt in the woods, so she helps her, but the woman warns Nancy to stay away. Naturally, this doesn't have the desired effect, and Nancy keeps investigating, witnessing some weird counterfeit activity in town. The girls are finally able to sneak into the cult's dancing ritual one night wearing robes and see stacks of counterfeit cash before getting caught. Secret agents come at just the right time and arrest the gang. So, as you can see, there were quite a few plot points that get tied up in this book, but I came up with a newspaper headline synopsis, and that is Counterfeiting Gang Busted by Teen Detective on Redgate Farm. Like, the stakes for Nancy Drew keep getting higher and higher. We started with her trying to help these people find a second will that they believed they were going to benefit from, and then we had someone impersonating Nancy in another book, and now she's dealing with, like, full-blown criminals in a counterfeiting ring. It's pretty crazy. So, I took some notes for this one, and it looks like I have quite a few. So the first thing that I wrote down is Oriental-looking clerk. This is how Nancy describes the woman that sells perfume to Bess. And I just wrote, off to a great start. I mean, I don't know what's worse, saying Oriental or assuming what somebody's nationality is, but I definitely saw that and took note of it. My next note is that Blue Jade sounds like a fun perfume. This is the name of the perfume that Bess buys from this woman, and I don't know, the whole time I just kept picturing, like, what would the ad for that have looked like? I keep thinking of Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds, and it's always like, this always brought me luck. Well, it certainly didn't bring Bess any luck, or Nancy, or George, because Bess spills this perfume all over Nancy. Like, I'm picturing, like, an Avon bottle of perfume, because I've found those, like, at thrift stores, and oh, they smell pretty rank. And especially in a high concentration like that. Plus, they're on a train car in July, so it's boiling hot outside, and then you've got this overpowering stench of perfume. Now, this next note, I had a lot of enjoyment in writing this down because George is always harassing Bess, but Bess really, like, zinged her back on this one. So, as if it's not enough that George is constantly fat-shaming Bess, she's harassing Bess on the train about her self-control and her spending. And so she says to Bess, you should practice self-control the way I do. But Bess says, I suppose you call a new hat, 2 dresses, 3 pairs of stockings, and a handbag self-control. What? Go, Bess. My next note just says Riverside Heights. I think it's so weird. So Nancy and Bess and George are from River Heights. And apparently there's a whole other place called Riverside Heights. I don't know who's in charge of naming these towns, but they shouldn't have done that. My next note is about Nancy going to the interview with Joanne. So Joanne, the girl on the train who fainted because Bess spilt perfume everywhere, she asks Nancy to go to the interview with her, which is kind of awkward in itself because, I don't know, if someone you didn't know invited you to just come along on a job interview, I would think that'd be super weird. But it gets even weirder because the guy tries to hire Nancy instead of Joanne. Nancy quickly picks up on the fact that this is a shady outfit too, because the guy who is interviewing Joanne starts to write down a message while he's taking a phone call, and she asks him about it, and he says, oh, it's just stock market. And so she says stock market numbers like fun. But basically, Nancy being Nancy, she can't let that go, so she writes down the numbers really quickly when he goes into the other room to talk to Joanne. And the book makes a huge deal out of Nancy being able to crack this code, but the code is basically the alphabet numbered. So 1 is A, 2 is B, 3 is C. They act like it's so groundbreaking that she figured this code out, so I don't know. But, I mean, it is her first big code that she's cracked, so whatever, props to Nancy. My next note is Bess says, just imagine having cream an inch thick. And she's talking about having milk at the farm because they have their own cows and they can get fresh milk every day and cream. And George says, just what you need for reducing. What the heck, George? Nobody even asked you. George is just so insanely rude. I wish Bess had spilled her perfume all over her instead of Nancy. So another segment that I like to do on the podcast is What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, but Nancy, George, and Bess are away at this farm, so Hannah's not around to do any cooking, but Miss Bird apparently makes them hot biscuits, sizzling ham, sweet potatoes, and lemon meringue pie. I'm not much of a ham fan, but the rest of that sounds really good. Actually, I'm not going to lie, any of that sounds good because for the last few days I've just been eating soup. So my next note said, the boarders come to the farm and Miss Salisbury complains of ailments all the time and Mr. Abbott eats everything in sight and hangs out in the kitchen teasing the girls. Ooh. I don't know, he kind of came off as sort of predatory because he was always following Nancy and Bess and George around in the kitchen and making all these comments oh, you girls are so nice to cook me some food, and just, I don't know, it was weird. Now, the Black Snake Colony, which is the cult that we see on the covers of the books, that is who Nancy is kind of trying to investigate. Why are they up on this hill dancing? What are they doing in this cave? And I think it's funny because she calls Chief McGinnis and he says he'll look it up in his database. And I'm like, what? Is there a database, an international database of cults? That seems like it'd be pretty useful, but it just made me laugh. The next thing that I wrote down is Bess said that she would have fainted if she'd been scared by the man at the cave. And George says, girls don't faint these days. Probably you'd have screamed and brought all the cult members down on you. They'd have dragged you off and put an end to you. And I love Bess's response. She just says, thanks, George. You say the nicest things. And I was like, my thoughts exactly, George. If you can't say anything nice, just keep your mouth shut. This next part of the notes kind of seems like retribution for what just happened because George gets bit by a snake and they have to carry her back to the farm. But she makes this another chance to crack at Bess's weight and she says, aren't you glad I don't eat as much as you do? I'm sorry, if I was Bess, I'd just throw George down and be like, you walk back to the farm yourself. She's so mean. So for this next part of the podcast, I like to call it Add That to Your Resume, and I wrote down some of the skills that Nancy showed in this book. So the first thing that I wrote down is code breaker, because although that was an easy code, Nancy did crack it and she did figure out that there was more to this, and it wasn't stock market numbers. I also wrote down that Nancy is an expert in poison control, because when George is bit by that snake, she, not only does she cut into George's leg with a knife, but she gets a tourniquet and she, ties it off on each side of the wound. But Nancy's apparently really good at that and I guess identifying poisonous snakes. For the third and final thing I put down that Nancy could put on her resume, she's an expert counterfeit detector. She just holds these bills even before she finds the ones in the cave and she's just this is suspicious. These don't look real. That does not look like George Washington. I mean, Nancy is pretty well off, and her dad is like Daddy Warbucks, so I guess she's pretty skilled at knowing what counterfeit money looks like. So this book was a bit of a wild ride. There were a lot of things that happened in this book that were kind of interesting. I liked the aspect of a cult, and I liked the aspect of the counterfeit money, but I wanted to list off some of the things I liked and some of the things I didn't like about The Secret of Redgate Farm. So basically, for the things that I liked about this book, I liked the perfume, the counterfeiters, all the plot points tied neatly together. There's some of these Nancy Drew books where it's kind of a stretch, and like the previous book, The Secret of Shadow Ranch, I feel like the whole plot with Alice and her dad could have just been thrown out completely. But this book dealt pretty nicely and tied everything together at the end. I also like the fact that there were several women in this crime ring. Usually it's a male villain, except for in the case of Gay Moreau, like she's probably the most influential female villain we've seen up to this point in The Mystery at Lilac Inn. But I kind of liked that Yvonne Wong and some other women were involved in this crime ring. Now for the things that I didn't like. You knew this one was coming, but George fat-shaming Bess and just generally making fun of her, I don't get it. I just want to sit George down if she were a real person and be like, what happened to you? Who hurt you? Why do you hurt people that you love? I don't understand. Like, Bess has done absolutely nothing to George except exist. Like, she's actually one of the most loyal friends in the book, and I hate the way George treats her. It makes me really sad. So for my overall rating for The Secret of Redgate Farm, I decided to give it 3 magnifying glasses. I think it was a pretty good book. It all tied together in the end. There were definitely some things that I didn't like, but it was a fairly good book. I definitely think there are better Nancy Drew books out there, but I did find this one fairly enjoyable to read. So yeah, that is my review for The Secret of Redgate Farm. Sorry to cut this episode short. My voice is really shot, and I appreciate you all putting up with it for this episode. But next episode, which is episode 9, we'll be talking about the clue in the diary. So I hope you all stay safe and stay well, and until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.